Hello everyone, I hope everything's good with you. I hope you are doing well today. It feels like a really long time since I've just sat down with a plant and kind of done a little bit of a deep dive and just chatted about a specific plant. And today I thought we could do a deep dive on the Maranta because it's one that I've loved for years and years and years. Pretty much since I first started getting into plants, I have absolutely adored the Maranta. And although it is a fairly easy plant to look after once you get the hang of it, it is one that I have struggled with, and there's been many things that I've overlooked in my time of owning this plant. There's been lots of things I would have done differently. And so I feel like it's taken me quite a while to actually strike a consistent good balance with this plant, if that makes sense. Like get to a level where I feel like for a long period of time I actually know it and I'm not having to deal with drama. So yeah, I'm hoping that today's video should help you to understand the plant a little bit better and just enjoy growing it a little bit more. So yes, that is what we're going to be doing today. But first, if you're new here, hi, my name's Claire and this is Yuli. I make videos all about houseplant care, sharing tips and tricks I've learned over the years to help keep your plants happy and healthy. And yeah, so as I say, I'm going to be taking you through everything I've learned, everything I would have done differently, all of the basics with this plant, and just some general tips and tricks to keep it happy, healthy, and growing beautifully for you. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it. So, the Maranta is a tropical rainforest plant native to Central and South America. And immediately, straight off the bat, just hearing rainforest, that immediately tells you so much about what this plant likes and what it doesn't like. And we will get into the specifics of that as we get into the video. But this one is commonly known as the prayer plant. And in a nutshell, it's known as the prayer plant for the same reason that lots of calatheas are, purely for the fact that they turn their leaves to face the light during the day and then they kind of fold up at night. And actually this one is incredibly mobile. Like I will often just like hear a little rustle, look up at the shelf that I've got it on, and I'll see this plant moving. It does like very much move throughout the day. And as I say, this one is often actually mistaken for a calathea, and although they are very closely related, they both belong to the Marantaceae family, the Maranta is actually a completely separate genus of plant within its own right. So even if you are very familiar with calatheas, you'll probably notice that there's some similarities between them, but they do have slightly different care requirements. And when it comes down to environmental factors for this plant, I personally think that Marantas are typically a little bit hardier than a lot of calatheas are. For example, like ones like the Calathea orbifolia, which is known for being such a drama queen. I feel like this is a much more adaptable plant, and to be honest, one that I probably enjoy growing a little bit more. There are some factors that you do have to take into consideration with Marantas that don't typically affect calatheas as much. And the one being, and this is honestly such a tip for Marantas and something to look out for and something that I wish I had known sooner, is how susceptible they are to mealybugs. And I had personally never struggled with mealybugs before, and this is the first plant I found them on, and they are so good at hiding. Like even if you are super on it with your pest checking, you're checking the fronts and the backs of the leaves and you can't see anything, typically mealybugs actually lodge themselves right in kind of like in the caterpillars of the plants, like right in those bits there. And a lot of times over the years with Marantas, I've just noticed that it will suddenly be looking a little bit unhappy, and I can't put my finger on why. Like nothing that I'm doing's changed. The roots look fine. And then if I just kind of have a look in there, I'll see a little bit of white fluff, and I'll put a picture of what mealybugs look like on the screen because they are just a nightmare and they can bring down your plant so quickly. So for me, as a general rule, if I've got a Maranta in the house, I try and just keep some isopropyl alcohol on hand because that is such an effective and quick way to kill mealybugs if they do pop up. But yeah, that's something that typically I haven't had to worry that much about with other prayer plants, whereas Marantas, they are just a magnet for them for some reason. But coming on to the environmental factors in a little bit more detail, the first thing you want to take into consideration with this plant is light. And this is one that you might have seen appear on kind of low light plants lists and all that sort of stuff, because as I say, it is very adaptable when it comes to its lighting conditions. And it is one that can grow really quite well in lower levels of light. And I stress lower because I do see people, oh my goodness, I see people growing this in like windowless bathrooms and spots that have literally no light at all. And they're like, why isn't this plant happy? And I'm like, because it's getting no light. Literally all plants require at least some natural light in order to grow and survive. So yeah, typically a good way to tell whether or not a low light spot is suitable for a lower light plant is to ask yourself if you could comfortably read a book in that area without straining your eyes. And if the answer's no, then it's probably not going to be good enough, even for a low light plant. So yeah, this is one that in its natural habitat grows quite close to the forest floor. So it is kind of growing constantly in the shade of other plants. So any bright, direct sunlight is going to be way too harsh for this plant. Even if you can acclimate it to take direct sun, which if you build it up very gradually over time, then you can, it's still not going to be the best thing for this plant. It's just going to stress the plant and you're going to find that it's not growing as beautifully as you probably want it to grow. If you do grow it on kind of like the upper ends of medium light though, you'll probably notice it start to bloom, and that's actually what mine is doing at the moment. And I'll put a little clip in of where, like the position I've got mine growing in, because mine's actually growing, it's going to sound like I'm growing it in really high light now, but it's actually growing in a south facing window, but it's growing, I always say southeast facing window. It's growing on the side of the window that actually never gets any direct sun. It just gets fairly like sheltered bright light throughout the day, and I've got plants growing in front of it, so it's got a little bit of a filter there, but it does receive fairly long hours of light. And I think that's the key, because again, looking at its natural environment, Central and South America, it does typically, even if it's not getting direct sun, it does typically get pretty long hours of light every single day. So yeah, that's something that I've found has really, really helped this one to grow happily, healthily and lovely and full for me. And as I've already mentioned, this can be one that is very susceptible to pests. I've already spoken about mealybugs purely because they are the ones that have brought down so many Marantas and seem to be kind of like the silent killer with this plant. But they can also be very susceptible to thrips and spider mites. So you do just need to make sure you're keeping an eye on them regularly. Fronts, backs of the leaves, as I've already said, just in all of the little joints, and I want to say like joints and hinges of the plant. I'm sure there's better ways of describing it, but yeah, just making sure you're kind of checking all the crevices of the plant. And a really good way to kind of kill two birds with one stone while you're doing your pest checking is to just use it as an opportunity to give your plant a wipe down and kind of combine the two, because this is a plant that you might not think gets dusty very easily. And I think because Marantas typically have beautiful patterns on their leaves, you don't notice dust and dirt building up that much on them. And even if you live in a really clean environment, it just happens. Like, it's the same way as you have to kind of like dust behind a bookshelf or something like that. Like, dust just gets there. And if you do have dust and dirt on the leaves, not only does it make your plant more susceptible to pests and disease, it also just acts as a bit of a filter and means that they can't effectively absorb light in the same way, and therefore can't photosynthesize and produce growth in the same way. So yeah, as I say, usually around about once a month. I probably should be more, but that's roughly the amount of time I make time to do it because I've got a lot of plants. I'll just go around with a damp cloth and a sponge, and I'll give the plant a wipe down. I'll give it a pest check at the same time, and as I say, just combine the two and make sure that the plant is happy. And there's some plants that I've got in my collection that I'm not quite as vigilant about that with. For example, like my Monstera deliciosa that I've got next to me here, that one has gone much more than a month without a wipe down before, but typically I haven't found that one to be as susceptible to pests and disease as this one, for example. So I think it all just comes down to getting to know your plants and getting to know what they like, what they don't like, and what they need in order to keep them happy. So yeah, that's the gist of it with light when it comes to this one. And I talk about it with actually all of the plants in my collection as well. But if you are moving your Maranta from one spot to another spot, just make sure you acclimate it slowly. So for example, if I wanted to move my one out of my south facing window at the moment and put it in a really low light spot in the bedroom, because it's not used to that level of low light, although it can adapt to it, just make it a slow and gradual transition. I'd probably just start moving it slowly back from the window and then slowly into its new spot, as opposed to just expecting it to adapt very quickly. But then when it comes to watering, this is another area where people can go a little bit wrong, because the Maranta is a plant, as I say, it's a rainforest plant, and it does enjoy quite a lot of moisture. It likes its substrate to remain fairly evenly moist, which is very similar to Calathea's. And it is a plant that you can absolutely grow in semi-hydro. I have grown my Marantas in semi-hydroponics before, but this one I've got here, I've currently just got growing in soil, and this is actually tree fern fibre and soil, and it's keeping this one really, really happy at the moment. When you say consistently moist with a substrate though, it kind of invites you to overwater without meaning to, because you think, oh, is that a little bit too dry? So you'll give it a little bit more and a little bit more. And if you give your plants too much water and they have got too much surrounding the roots that they can't absorb, that essentially just makes the roots turn to mush, and then the plant will die very quickly. So it's all about striking the right balance. And if you're a new plant parent and you can't tell just by like looking and feeling the soil, I would highly recommend investing in a moisture meter. You can get them very cheaply on Amazon. I used to use one. I nowadays feel like I know, like when you've had a plant for a while, you do just kind of get to know it and you get a little bit complacent, but touch wood, nothing's gone wrong yet. So yeah, I now just like stick my finger down the soil and feel, and I can see, like just putting my finger out there, that the soil is quite damp. Like you can see it's kind of clinging to my finger, and typically I will just wait for the top layer of soil to be a little bit dry to the touch, and then I'll give it a water through. And every single time I water this plant through, I'll take it out and I'll let it fully drain, and then I'll put it back into its pretty pot, because this one actually doesn't have drainage. And some types of prayer plants, again, primarily Calatheas, can be quite sensitive to the chemicals and minerals found in tap water. And I often get questions about whether or not you should be using distilled water or rainwater for these plants. And prayer plants as a whole, the Marantaceae family as a family does very much enjoy cleaner water. They do enjoy rainwater. I pretty much always just leave like a watering can or a bowl or a bucket or something out on my balcony and collect water to water these plants. But it's absolutely not necessary. Like this is one that has never kicked up a stink because I give it tap water. And sometimes in fact, I say sometimes, a lot of the time I do just fill up my watering can as normal from the tap, water this one through, and it's fine. So yeah, that's really, as I say, using a purer form of water is really just if you want to give this plant a bit of a boost, or maybe if you live in an area where you have got extremely hard water. I will say as well though, if you have a water softener, that is not good to use on houseplants, and this is one that will likely respond quite badly to that. I believe it's because the sodium levels are incredibly high. Is it sodium? I don't even know if it is. But it's basically just not good for your plants, and it can make them very unwell over time. So yeah, if you do have a water softener, that's when I would recommend using distilled or rainwater, or something much purer, fish tank water if you can get your hands on it, something like that for your Marantas. But then when it comes to fertilizing, I've said it before, I personally nowadays, I found a fertilizer that I absolutely love, and I personally will fertilize my plants all year round so long as they're actively growing. If a plant goes into a state of dormancy and it's not really doing anything for a while, I will hold back on the fertilizer because I don't want to kind of overload it with nutrients that it doesn't need. But currently, as you can see, this one is, obviously it's flowering, it's putting out lots of growth in that area. It's also got like a new leaf unfurling there. It's got lots and lots and lots of new growth it's putting out. So I do just continue to fertilize it all year round, even during the winter months. And the fertilizer that I personally like to use is called Liquid Gold Leaf. I have banged on about it so many times before, not sponsored. I just love the fertilizer. I'll link it down below. But yeah, that's one that I just find is really great for plants that I'm growing in semi-hydro soil, succulents, aroids. Like, it just is a great all-rounder, and as I say, helps to keep my plants really, really happy. So that for me is personally what I stick to. But something really important for this plant, and again, this comes back to rainforest plants, like going back to its natural habitat. This is a plant that absolutely loves humidity, and it is a little bit more resilient in terms of being able to tolerate lower humidity conditions compared to certain types of calathea, as I've already said, but it is still one that loves it. And when it comes to this plant, don't worry about too much humidity. Like, this is one that would happily grow in 100% humidity if you were able to provide it. And I know a lot of the time in a home environment, that is just not realistic. The humidity here in my space typically sits around about 60%. I do have a humidifier that I run from time to time. I can be quite bad at remembering to fill it. But yeah, typically the humidity stays around 60%, but ideally kind of 60 to 80% would be perfect for this plant, just helping it to stay lovely air conditioned and free of brown spots, because often if you notice kind of crispy edges on plants, a really common reason that happens, it can be down to a few things, but a really common reason that happens is because it's not getting enough humidity. So yeah, but also if you are like me and you've got lots and lots of houseplants, often just having lots of plants together in one space can be enough to essentially like naturally raise the humidity levels, because as plants transpire, they do release water and they essentially kind of act as a bit of a humidifier for each other. So I've got, I think, about 250 plants in this room alone. And for that reason, I don't worry too much when I don't run my humidifier, and everything seems pretty happy. So yeah, that is how I do things here. But everyone's space is different. Just because I do things one way, it doesn't mean that things are going to respond the same in your space. But then temperature wise, again, this one is fairly adaptable, but the main thing, so ideally you would be keeping the temperature for this plant between about 18 and 30 degrees Celsius if you possibly can. It can absolutely tolerate lower drops in temperature as well, but the main thing to think about with this plant is just trying to keep a steady temperature, a steady and consistent temperature. So for example, don't put it right next to a drafty door or a drafty window or somewhere where the temperature is kind of going to be fluctuating, because that is when you're going to see signs of stress in this plant. And again, there are certain types of houseplant that are much more resilient in this area that really won't give you much grief. This is one that I found can give you a little bit of grief if you're not keeping things fairly stable. So yeah, I've said it before, although air circulation is important, like I've got a fan that I run a lot of the time in this room to just kind of keep the air moving. That is different from a very drafty cold door, because that's not going to be good for the plant. But yeah, and then I guess finally, I feel like I've kind of whizzed through this video, but finally, when it comes to propagation for this plant, this is one that I am constantly chopping and propagating, primarily just because it's so beautiful. I love having sections of it growing all over my flat. But at some point I do plan on potting all of the rooted sections up together and getting a really big full plant going, because although this one's doing very well, it's a little bit sparse and I think it could be doing better. So that's the grand plan. But it's a really, really easy one to propagate. And of course you can propagate in many different ways. Some people will like to use leca, some people will like to use perlite, sphagnum moss. I keep it really simple for this plant and I just use plain old water, and I do use tap water for this. And you just want to chop beneath a node, and the node is the little bumpy bit here where either a stem will branch out or the leaf will meet the main stem. You can see actually that's probably quite a good example just there. And if you look on some of the older nodes, like here for example, you can actually see the start of little aerial roots there, which are those little bumps. And that is where your roots on your new cutting will form from. So if I was going to take a cutting of this plant right now, I could take the cutting just there, and I'd stick it in water, and I would have thought probably within a week or two I'd be able to see the start of new roots. Probably quicker than a couple of weeks, but it depends on the time of year that you propagate. But yeah, if any of you have got any questions about this plant, then please do let me know. And as I say, if you're looking for more info on calatheas, I've done lots of individual breakdowns on different types of calatheas because they can have slightly different care requirements. But yeah, do let me know if you've got any questions about this one specifically, and I will do my best to help. But if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, have a lovely day, and I will see you in the next video.
Stay sexy, plant lovers.